Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here for this panel to discuss the practical implications on democratizing the firm. We've got a fantastic lineup of people here, and I'm delighted to welcome them with all of their deep experience and knowledge and understanding of the challenges and opportunities of democratizing the firm. And I'd like to start off, please, with Andrea Felicetti. Do correct me if that's wrong. Thank you very much. You're very tolerant. And Andrea is Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the Scuola Normale, Superiore. And he's going to talk on the topic of a deliberative case for democracy in firms. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you. Can I get started then?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much once again, and hello everybody, and thanks for having me here. It enables me to learn a lot from this unique experience that you're running, and perhaps also to contribute to it. Also, I would like to thank all people working behind this idea and behind this movement. I hope I might contribute also in the future. So my little contribution today wants to focus on some work that I published a few years ago, and I kept updating since. And it rotates around the idea of democracy in workplaces and firms, but in particular around the idea of deliberative democracy in firms. So all of us and many people nowadays agree on the need of having more democratic firms, business organizations, workplace democracy. And in this occasion, I wanted to present a case for a specific type of democratization, that is deliberative democratization. So why am I doing this? Because I think that deliberation has a specific contribution to give to the democratization of our economic environment. In particular, I should present, first of all, what I mean by deliberation. So the deliberative democracy is a way of approaching democratic theory that focuses on the quality of communication. So a society, a process, an organization is democratic to the extent that its communications have certain characteristics. In the first place, a deliberative communication should not be affected by coercion. It also should help inducing reflections about the preferences that individuals hold. So it's not that after deliberation we need to change our mind, but we should be open to it. In a deliberation, in a communication that is deliberative, specific points should be connected to more general claims. So the way of arguing is not, I want this because it's good for me, but you should explain why that it's also good, might be interesting and good for others. And deliberative communication is characterized by reciprocity. That is a way of discussing, of communicating that others can accept. So it's not just respect, but it's really making an effort to be understood from others. So this kind of deliberative communication becomes democratic when it is inclusive. So inclusive of different interests, people, and discourses that might be affected by a certain decision. Deliberation can occur without it being democratic. But what we want is democratic deliberation, that is a good quality communication that is inclusive and is also consequential. That is, people joining in a deliberation should not be talking for the sake of it only, but also to affect the decisions that are made. So this is a bit of a premises, a preamble of what I mean by deliberative democratization of business firms. We know that, for instance, participatory Democrats have been stressing the idea of workplace democracy for a long time. Deliberative Democrats haven't done that, have focused mostly on different ways of democratizing societies. For instance, you might know citizen assemblies. But I think that, and I try to show that without democratizing business firms, it's very difficult to attain a more deliberative democratic society. And what ways forward to democratize our business organizations? I try to answer to this question in two ways. First, I make a proposal for workplace deliberation. So that is deliberative democracy inside firms. And then I make a case for business deliberation, that is deliberation across firms. To explain briefly both concepts, I start with workplace deliberation. That essentially means making space for deliberative democratic logics within firms. So in a democratic, my way of arguing about this starts from the idea of, for instance, a scholar, an author called Iris Marion Young, that argued that in a democratic system there exists a presumption of democratic decision making in all institutions, broadly intended, including firms. So I think that it's important to stress this point on the need for democratizing business firms, because without deliberative democratic engagement, democratic society will continue to uncritically accept the relation of production that are defined by our economic systems. Instead, if you have democratic deliberation within firms, you start to have places to question the logics of the economic system, where the economic system reproduces itself, that is, in business firms. Now, I'm not saying that workplace deliberation would have an easy time in all contexts. There are contexts that are genuinely adversarial ones. For instance, in my home city, a big firm just fired 400 workers via email, and many of them were informed through WhatsApp, to give you an idea. So this is not a place that is likely going to be open to democratic deliberation within. But there is a possibility, and most of all, a need to democratize these places in order to prevent things from going that way. So it might be too late now in some instances, but it's not too late for all business firms. And also, besides these hard cases, there are also cooperative spaces, spaces that might be more welcoming to democratic deliberation. Think of cooperatives. When writing, I was making reference to experiments, innovative experiments with B corporations. There is a need, that there is ground to build deliberative processes within firms as we know them today. And also the other way forward that I mentioned is business deliberation. That is essentially making space for deliberative democracy in society via business organizations. So as of today, we promote deliberative democracy to citizen assemblies, but that's not the only thing we can do. We can ask business firms to involve through deliberative democratic processes those who are affected by their operations. So we can randomly we can do random sortation of different groups like workers, customers, stakeholders, and have them contributing to decision making about business firms. I'm not saying that every organization needs to be this, but I would think it desirable for a democratic state to sit at the table around the table only with firms that make some space for deliberative democracy in their own working, since if you are relating to a state that welcomes democratic and deliberative principles, as Western governments, for instance, should do, then you can make this requirement. to encourage deliberative business deliberation in firms. So these, very briefly, are two ways that I was thinking for promoting deliberative democracy in firms. And I think that we need to think of ways to democratize firms, because without deliberation in business firms, the opportunity for citizens to participate in choices upon matters that affect them diminishes consistently. One thing is that if the place where you work enables you to make decisions that are quite directly relevant to your own livelihood. One thing is if everybody is systematically excluded from this type of decisions. That makes for two different kinds of societies, one of which is more democratic than the other one. And also, by involving workers and people in business firms deliberation, you have a way to actually use reason giving, that of course in deliberation, as a mechanism to steer democratic societies. So you don't leave the democratic choices only if that at state level, but also at the level of the working parts of society. So essentially, we need to think of other deliberative spaces besides, for instance, citizens' assemblies. And one of the last ideas that I have developed, that will be very quick, is a reflection about liberal democracy. When we talk about workplace democracy, we always take liberal democracy as the background against which we push our struggles. But then I ask myself the question, can liberal democracy thrive without democratic business organizations? Probably cannot thrive, but it can definitely survive. It is surviving, barely perhaps, but it is surviving nowadays without an incentive for further democratization of firms. In fact, many firms go in the direction opposite to democracy. So I think that to conceive of spaces for substantial democratization, we need to start thinking beyond liberal democracy. In saying this, I'm not saying we should reject it. Far from it. The opposite is true. We should hold liberal democracy dear for what it can offer us. But at the same time, we should start recognizing the limitation it poses to the project of democratizing firms and start thinking also beyond that. So deliberative democracy could be a more suitable context regime to promote workplace democracy and more democratic firms. I think I spent all my 10 minutes and I'll give you back the floor. Thank you very much for following me.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Indeed, I think that was a brilliant opening, actually. It really framed the arguments I think that other people are going to make and the experiences that they bring, thinking about how a participatory society depends upon and requires democratizing businesses and firms. And I think that leads us really well into the next presentation, which is going to be from a team from Leopold Franzen's University of Innsbruck. And they are going to talk upon the topic of democratizing work means changing structures of domination and empowering employees to develop civic orientations. And I hope that they're going to be able to share their slides with us. Can I invite everybody who might be here listening, if you would like to put questions to the speakers or just questions generally up in the chat, we will try to pick those up later and when we have a discussion. So I would like to hand things over to Wolfgang, Christine, and colleagues.
Yeah. Now we are trying again with our expert to put our presentation into the system, and we will see and go to the lyrics. Yeah. Please. Schwierig, schwierig.
Wo ist der Ordner?
Ja, da ist die,
Ja,
genau.
okay.
Da jetzt auf Dokumente.
Dokumente.
Ja, dann Moment, Democratizing Work, ja. Und die zweite von oben ist es, ja. Sind wir eigentlich noch auf Sendung?
Yes.
Und jetzt?
Please wait a moment. Ja.
No, this, sorry.
Now we see a infinite circle.
It's an extraordinary infinite regress that we've got here. It's really quite spectacular.
Very sorry. Very sorry. It doesn't work. It's also really very difficult without presentation. I think we can write, but it's very complex.
Would it be possible? Would it be possible to ask Ali, our technical moderator, if he could share the slides, and then you do this the next slide please method?
Yeah. Yes, that would be good. That would be excellent.
Ali, would you be able to share their slides with us? Thank you.
Okay. See the slides?
Can you see the slides? There's a title page with the University of Innsbruck picture. Da sind wir jetzt rausgeflogen, oder?
Nein, ist nicht hier.
Ja, okay. Yes, if it's possible that you present the slides picture after picture, that would work. The slides that I had sent you, this would be great. I don't know why it doesn't work. We have tried it and tried, but.
Hello, Ali. Have you got the slides there that you can share with us for this team?
Vielleicht schaffen die es. Ja.
Hier ist der, oder?
Ja, das wäre. Erlauben ging jetzt. Ich habe jetzt probiert natürlich der Moderator auch.
Ja.
Ja.
Nee, aber jetzt.
Mhm.
The screen share?
Nee. Mhm. Ja, sonst zeige ich es dein Teil. Verstehen, eventuell auf Einstellungen. Das geht wahrscheinlich schon. Ach, wir können die ganze Sitzung entfalten. Mhm. No,
Sorry.
No, we are very sorry. It doesn't work. We have tried 10 times, but I don't know what it is. Perhaps the best would be that we take our presentation, the last one, and I try to present Christina's part of it. We don't want that it lasts too long with our technical problems. It's not good.
We have the first slide up.
Do you see it?
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, you can see it.
First slide, second slide.
Yes, the second slide says, yes. Do you see the picture of Otto Bauer, the photograph?
We do. So hopefully we can now move on to the next slide. If Ali can move us along.
Yes, then. No. Oh.
Okay. Nein, alles gut.
Ja, kann ich? Okay. Please excuse us. Now I will give you a high-speed contribution from first a very brief history of the Austrian economic democracy in 3 cutouts. It begins in 1919. There was an Austrian law on socialization, which was contemplated by the left wing of the Social Democratic Party. You got for a short time the political power in Austria. there was a more encompassing law of socialization, but unfortunately, only a very diluted version could be realized. And at the core, there was a foundation of 8 socio-economic undertakings. It was called the Gemeinwirtschaftliche Anstalten. They were big enterprises, and they were subdivided in a network of further dependent firms with several thousand of employee co-owners. I only give some examples. If you look at item number 2, these were big industrial plants in the region of Austria, or number 3. It was a pharmaceutical production, including a mineral water factory. And if you look at item number 8, the last one, there was the public housing and building materials company. And this was the only one that had survived until fascism had conquered Austria, but it was refounded and it is still existing today in Vienna, as far as I have seen. There was a democratic structure of those social economic enterprises. You see it, there was a general assembly of the different owners. There was a supervisory committee, a democratic supervisory committee with delegates. There was a relatively strong board of management, and this was a problem. And the employees participated in profit sharing. You see that the ownership structure was perhaps something like a stakeholder democracy. On the one hand, there was the state, or also big cities like Vienna and Graz, who had some ownership shares, but also consumption agricultural cooperatives, a hospital found in one case, and of course the mass of the employees were participated in co-ownership, and so on. There's a big historical study of Erwin Weisel where I refer to. Here you see Otto Bauer, the former minister, thanks, yes, I have to go on, who was the Spiritus Rector. Now, of course, after a short boom, after the First World War, it failed. In 1926, only one of those big enterprises survived. It had to do, the failing had to do with doministic, but also with foreign policy pressures. And if you would look at the last part of this slide, there were, of course, conflicting interests of the workers' representative between short-term high income that they wanted and long-time sustainable investments. The middle part, I only give reference. Those ideas were taken up again by Alfred Dallinger, Austrian Federal Minister of Social Affairs and Labor, who enabled a rough estimate is between 20 and 40 enterprises in several industries and crafts. 2 of them still we have found they survived still up to date. The Waldviertler shoe manufacturing and the Maldek painting work co-op. Why did they survive? Because there were no elephants and because they had direct forms of democracy and not so much degenerating representative. The last one, Christine is doing heavy research in the economy for the common good that was founded in 2010. If you only look at Austria, you see there are 147 firms that did a full audit and 137 that did a peer audit. We have a rough estimate that 1/6 of those more or less social enterprises have realized encompassing employee participation. This was my part. Please.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for this very interesting outline on the Austrian history of democratic enterprises. And I will now focus on empirical research that we conducted at the University in Innsbruck, in Austria. So concretely, our research question within the ODEM project was, do democratic principles in organizations foster the readiness of employees to act democratically and socially responsible? And for that purpose, we asked if organizational democracy and the social moral climate, if they are positively related with employees' work-related pro-social orientations and with employees' community-related value orientations. Theoretically, we refer to Carol Pateman's spillover hypothesis, which states that democratic participation in the enterprise has an educative effect in that sense that employees may experience a sense of political efficacy through participating in organizational decision-making. Moreover, by experiencing such a political efficacy at work, the employees will show political engagement and active citizenship behaviors at the workplace, but also in civil society. And accordingly, we assume that organizational democracy can contribute to the common good. But what do we exactly mean with organizational democracy? So the term organizational democracy refers to broad-based and institutionalized employee influence processes that are not ad hoc or occasional in nature, and in which the majority of employees generally participate in a form of institutionalized and binding decision-making in tactical decisions or strategic decisions about issues at the organizational level. And employees participate either directly, as Wolfgang already mentioned, within meetings or general assemblies, or indirectly through their representatives. And employees may hold a share in their organization's equity capital, but this is this must not be. This is just an optional criterion.
Need not be.
It need not to be. So in Innsbruck, we investigated two indicators of organizational democracy: organizational structure characteristics and individually perceived participation. We surveyed the organizational structure characteristics with interviews and document analysis based on a typology of democratically structured enterprises, and individually perceived participation with a self-report questionnaire for the analysis of individually perceived participation. Now, let's move on to the results from a series of our ODEM projects. So we summarized the results of 4 different publications with different sample sizes, and we only present simple bivariate correlations. Of course, in our publications, we used much more sophisticated statistical analysis like SEM or multi-level analysis and methods, but we think for this purpose, the correlations give us a good picture on the results. And they show that the organizational structure are positively related with solidarity, with employees' solidarity at work, with employees' humanitarian, egalitarian ethic, with their democratic engagement orientation, and with self-efficacy concerning justice in the world. Individually perceived participation is also significantly related to these orientations, but additionally, individually perceived participation is also positively and significantly related with pro-social work orientations and perspective taking. So for solidarity at work and self-efficacy, here we see that the structures are stronger related than the perceived participation. For humanitarian egalitarian ethics, the structure and the participation are nearly similar, but for all other outcomes or democratic orientations of employees, the individually perceived participation has a stronger effect. And this is what we also found or very similar in our recently conducted meta-analysis, in which we summarized 60 publications. So here we see that so it's really similar to our results, that the structure is positively related with pro-social work orientations, with civic and democratic orientations, not significantly, and also with perceived supportive organizational climate. And all these correlations were again stronger with individually perceived participation. So this was also true for job and work satisfaction, where work satisfaction was not related with the structure, but it was positively related with individually perceived participation. The only exception was the value-based commitment, and here we found quite strong correlations with all indicators of organizational democracy. So to conclude, the conclusion we draw is that individually perceived participation has stronger effect on democratic competences than the organizational structure. Of course, there are several limitations within our studies. So we surveyed the outcome variables only with self-report questionnaires, which means that the data may be biased with common method and with social desirability. We cannot claim causality because of the cross-sectional design of the studies. And finally, we assume a socialization effect, but we, of course, also selection effects may be at play. So therefore, longitudinal studies would be very, very important. And we are now part of an EU Horizon application with several proven and well-known experts, also with Ruth. And within that framework, we want to conduct such a longitudinal study and hope that it will get funded. So we cross our fingers, and I hope you will do that too. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much indeed. That was really great. Excellent listening. Thank you very much indeed. Very, very glad that you were able to deliver that for us. And for me, just highlighted the importance of having an empirical basis to the argument that we all want to make, that democratizing organizations is critical for democratic and participatory societies. I was also interested in some of the hints that arise out of your data of the tensions and dilemmas that there are inherent in trying to bring all of those things together. You mentioned earlier on that the short term and the long term, and I wondered also about the tensions that there might be between the individual and the collective and the societal perspectives. And I do wonder, actually, and maybe Charlotte, as we go on to her, she can illuminate some of this perhaps in her topic, that this gets us into the territory of emotions and our relationships towards one another, and how we help one another to navigate and carry the burdens of the tensions that come with democratizing work and democratizing society. So burdens and opportunities. And so what I'm going to do then is to hand over to Charlotte. She's going to talk to us on the topic of, could a compassionate workplace be both radical and compassionate? And she is a professor of company law and corporate governance at the University of Bristol. So Charlotte, I don't know whether you're going to try to share your slides or just talk. I think
I might use my slides for me rather than have all the complications. But I'm hoping that you'll still be able to see me, because I am going to use my slides for me. So please do bear with me. I'm just going. So can you still see me?
Yes.
Fantastic. So I'll just speak to my slides and hopefully be able to get my point across. But I'm happy to share the slides with anybody after the event if you wanted to contact me. So my approach here is to suggest that a compassionate approach to leadership and management and a compassionate kind of organizational approach might get us some way towards a more democratic workplace. And I think that it's quite an important possibility, bearing in mind the experience that we have all had globally. And so I ask a number of questions in this paper, and I'm not suggesting that this is, you know, an absolute panacea. And I think that there are warnings to be had with this possible approach, but I see some potential in it. So I kind of make that point at the outset. But the context in which I'm speaking, I think, is relevant to the discussion. You know, we have all globally experienced the COVID pandemic in some way or other. And obviously for some people, it has been an absolutely horrific time. Whether they have had bereavements, whether they've been ill, whether they've lost their jobs, whether they've gone through financial worries, or just the pure sort of if you like, stress and trauma of seeing what has been going on around us. So I think that that gives us a really interesting context in which to have this discussion. And I'd also, as a corporate governance expert, highlight the point that I think it's fair to say that society is very tired of the dominance and the predominance of a shareholder primacy approach to business operations. And I think that people are questioning the capitalistic structures that we've been working with for rather a long time now. I think we've begun to see more widely the limitations of the approaches that we have long been using to business activity. So for a compassionate approach, what do I mean by that? Well, compassion can mean a number of things, but I take the idea of, if you like, a relational response to each other, where, you know, going really back to a kind of philosophical, religious-y kind of approach from the Dalai Lama, who describes compassion as being associated with a sense of commitment, responsibility, and respect towards other people. So this commitment, responsibility, and respect, I think, comes about through connection with each other, through understanding each other's needs and feelings. So it's very much an emotional response and an emotional connection to our fellow human beings. And in the workplace, of course, we connect with each other on a often a long-term basis, but certainly, you know, if we're working side by side with each other, that relational process becomes very apparent and very important to us. So within the labour context, perhaps compassionate management means a willingness to protect workers and to alleviate their suffering and to perhaps share their burden. It's about building consensus and trust and communication. So I kind of see this compassionate approach as potentially a precondition for the democracy that Andrea is talking about, and perhaps also as a precondition for the pro-social attitudes more broadly in society that Wolfgang and Christina are talking about. So I wonder if we can maybe explore that together in the discussion part. But in the end, what does it really mean? It's about perhaps thinking about the person we're working with or the person that we are managing or leading and asking, how is this person experiencing the workplace? And if there are problems that are clear to see, then how can I help that person have a better experience in the workplace? One might come straight back at me and say, Charlotte, this is just another way of exercising power. And that is something that I worry about with this concept of compassion. You know, is it something that we see a giver and a receiver? And does the giver have more power? And, you know, is the receiver becoming, in a way, someone who's reliant upon and dependent upon the giver? I'm not sure that I would want that to happen. What I'm hoping for is that compassion can be used as a way of empowering the recipients, so that then more positive and equalized relationships can be created and built up. So the 4 strands of compassionate management that we see in the literature around this area is about, include attending, understanding, empathizing, and helping our fellow workers. And in the UK, our National Health Service, which many of you are probably seeing is under considerable threat at the moment, but it is something that we are proud of generally in the UK. And that's an area where the notion of compassion is seen as very strong. In fact, the constitution of our National Health Service includes the word compassion as a way of building the culture of that National Health Service. And writers have suggested that this idea of compassion means paying attention to all staff and patients, really listening to them and being present. It's about empathy. It's about feeling each other's feelings, their fears, their stresses, their uncertainties, their anxieties, and looking for ways to alleviate them, looking for ways to take away the problems and to make that working life easier and more effective and more constructive for everybody. But interestingly, Bailey and West highlight the point that it involves voice and influence over workplace decisions. So the workers are to be given that voice and influence. Otherwise, how on earth can the managers really understand them? How on earth can the managers really attend to them and listen to them if they are not given a degree of voice or influence within their workplace? So I think it is about sharing knowledge and ideas and making sure that the worker's voice is really heard. And some compassion theorists talk about the idea of a eudynamic well-being, which include features such as autonomy, purpose, self-acceptance. In other words, a way to live that is vital and that is enabled, that we are living an enhanced life and that we are given the ability to live that life of enhancement. But how can we do this in the workplace? Well, I think that hierarchical structures are problematic for this. Certainly in the larger organization, if they are based in a hierarchical fashion, we end up with the boardroom perhaps not having any real connection with those at the lowest level of that hierarchy because they don't come into contact with them. So perhaps we need flatter, more web-like structures, or indeed the structure that Wolfgang and Christina are talking about through the sort of workers having some influence in the boardrooms. Those kind of structures, I think, are going to be relevant. What we want to see are relational networks that have a degree of flexibility and a way of understanding that everybody within this workplace have different roles, that their outside workplace roles matter just as much as their roles within the workplace, because that's what makes up our whole society. So there are some systems conditions, if you like. There is an appreciation of role interdependence, that we are all in the workplace dependent upon each other for that workplace to operate successfully. But through that, we generate an emotional connection with each other. So it does include all of what Andrea has been talking about with his idea of deliberation, this idea of discussion, communication. All of that matters. There are risks of compassion fatigue, and I think that that can happen where a workplace is not structured in a way that builds up the ability to have compassion with each other. If you're having to make too much effort to do it, then there may be something wrong with the overall structure of the workplace or the organization. But a number of other writers talk about what kinds of values compassionate corporations might have. So Beju, for example, talks about having responsible workplace practices, adherence to the principles of integrity, supporting human rights, etc., etc. These are all kind of connected values and principles. And servant leadership maybe a mentality that is worth nurturing, because my own research tells me that servant leaders tend over the long term to be successful leaders compared to those who are more self-centered. And I think a shift away from financialization wouldn't go amiss, and perhaps instead replacing that with a shift towards more localized and circular economies, a little bit like what Wolfgang and Christina have been describing. And I think that our labour laws are relevant in all of this. If we have very weak labour protections, then it's going to be so much more difficult to build up that compassionate style of management, because the labour laws are not actually encouraging it. So I think that we need to build up better protections and to take away our emphasis on financialisation, which some writers have suggested are actually worsen conditions for the employees. And so for me, I see the role of trade unions as being especially important here. In the UK, we've seen over the last 40 years the trade unions being significantly undermined. But I think a more compassionate style of management would encourage trade union and collective activity, because I think that it's through trade unions that we've seen some of the best examples of solidarity, of close connection, of cooperation. And I think that, you know, we can do some things around our relationships with trade unions to improve and enhance this possibility. So overall, I see compassion as having a role to play, and potentially a key role in ensuring that workers are given dignity in the workplace, because it is a manifestation of solidarity, empathy and brotherhood. And the goal is to notice and to reduce another person's suffering. And if we do that, we then empower that person to be able to go on and do better things and happier things in their life, to have more well-being. And trade unions, I think, are a very good place to start with that, because they've already shown good examples of that kind of behaviour. And if compassion is to be embraced, I would argue that we should bring trade unions back to the centre stage. So compassion requires that managers, acting with integrity, listen to their workers' voice. They ensure their well-being and respect social justice, and trade unions may provide that voice. And I just end with a warning. I started this talk with talking about the context, and in our country, our Chancellor, our Budget Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, at the beginning of the pandemic said that, oh, we have to treat people with compassion. And he introduced the furlough scheme, and he introduced some help for people who live on benefits. So he framed that as a compassionate gesture. But this week, that universal credit, that extra benefit, is going to be taken away from many people. And that worries me, that compassion has lots of potential, but it only has potential if it is given and delivered in the right way. If it is merely empowering the giver and not the recipient, I would argue that that is a very low level of compassion, and possibly not compassionate at all in the long term. So I hope that what I've given to you today it gives some opportunity for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was really great. And I think led us very nicely through to our last presentation, which is going to be delivered by Milap Patel. But as you gave your warning, I was thinking about what you said about power relations and how we could have quite severe inequalities in the receiving of benefits out of the relational process. and what we might need in terms of safeguarding of democratic systems, the kind of systemically embedded organizational democracy that Wolfgang talks about, as well as the ideal that Andrea talks about.
Yeah.
And Milap's topic is indeed on power, so we really couldn't be doing any better. Milap is a research director for the Institute for Multi-Stakeholder Integrity, and he's going to talk to us on shifting power, assessing worker and community-centric alternatives to conventional organizations. So Milap, I don't know whether you're going to try to share your slides or just speak. Again, I'll leave that decision to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth, and for the other panelists. Excuse me if I sound a little stuffed up, a little early in the morning and coming down with something, but really a privilege to join the democratizing work conversation on this topic. And I will attempt to share my slides, but it's really not a problem if it doesn't work. I've been a little scared by the experience of the other panelists, but let me just see how I can do this. Okay. Awesome. I think you can see it. I'm not sure if you all can see it. Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, cool. So hey everyone. So I'm going to be talking about a new project that our nonprofit, MSI Integrity, has launched this year. So I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different angle from some of the other presenters so far. So it's still in research phase or conceptualization stage. So I'm very eager to hear contributions and comments from others, and as well as people who want to follow up afterwards. As Ruth said, it's called Shifting Power, Assessing Worker and Community-Centric Alternatives to Conventional Corporations. So we're really focusing on corporate form for this presentation. And the project aims to offer an overview and an analysis of alternatives to the dominant corporate form, some of which may actually represent real advances in workplace democracy. So the presentation that I'm going to give today will go into a bit of how we decided to focus on this subject and a little bit of our research scope. So just to note that we're primarily talking here about the US context, though our eventual research will go into relevant examples and experiences from other contexts. So who are we? We are a human rights research organization based here in the US that were incubated at Harvard University's International Law Clinic over 10 years ago to interrogate the efficacy of what's known as multi-stakeholder initiatives, MSIs for short. So MSIs are voluntary arrangements between civil society, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to address human rights or environmental harms linked to business activities. They're pretty global in nature. A famous example of an MSI that many people might have heard of is Fair Trade International, but it also includes groups in the groups like the Global Network Initiative, which includes ICT companies, civil society organizations, academics, investors in its membership. So MSIs came about in the 90s and 2000s during a period of globalization where many scholars, activists, industry representatives, governments were searching for a pragmatic alternative or a third way between industry self-regulation and binding government regulation. So we conducted research into, as I said, the efficacy of these MSIs to uphold human rights and environmental standards. A lot of community involvement in the research. It took many years, but the research culminated in this area in a report released in 2020 called Not Fit for Purpose, which surprisingly, by its name, or not surprisingly, found that MSIs were actually not effective tools for holding corporations accountable for abuses, for protecting rights holders against human rights violations, or providing survivors and victims with access to remedy. So why is that? And I'm sure folks on this panel can guess why. A few main reasons relevant for this conversation on democratizing work. Firstly, through the design, governance, and implementation of MSIs, corporations have preserved their autonomy and safeguarded their interests throughout. Major corporations avoid sharing power with other stakeholders, such as rights holders or affected communities, because to do so would actually threaten their obligation to their main stakeholder, which is their shareholders. And that's what we sort of simplistically call the dominant corporate form, the shareholder primacy model that was already referenced before. So our conclusion from this report was that those interested in human rights, those interested in reimagining corporate behavior, have to reimagine the corporate form itself to essentially distribute power away from a limited set of stakeholders, i.e. democratize them. So as we thought about where to take our work next, there were several hypotheses or guiding principles that were sort of foremost in our minds. I'm sure you all know that recent efforts by corporations to promote what's become known as stakeholder capitalism, which involves either changing the purpose of a corporation, considering non-shareholder stakeholders through perhaps third-party certifications like benefit corporations or B Corps. These have risen in prominence in recent years, especially through statements here in the US. I'm sure people have heard of the Business Roundtable statement on considering a broader set of stakeholders for corporate purpose. So we're going to question and look into whether these types of voluntaristic efforts actually represent important first steps or are just rebranding the status quo as progressive facing, much like many MSI's label-washed corporations. Something else we're mulling over: if top-down voluntaristic actions by corporations, such as public pledges or certification schemes, just reinforce corporate power, what shifts actually distribute power more equally to workers and broader community members? Is it receiving higher wages or other benefits? Is it a share in profits? Is it control over governance and decision-making in the firm itself? So finally, we want to take cue from what's known as the social and solidarity economy field that have identified and hypothesized that ownership and control over the firm reflects more meaningful shifts in power for workers in affected communities. So while we may be somewhat new to this realization, many other organizations and movements, both here in the US and across the world, have been supporting alternative corporate structures for many years. And so we asked what we could bring to this space through our research. So as we looked around, one of the things we saw from this sort of alternative corporate form space was that there was a few sort of knowledge gaps that we sort of identified. The first was there's a sort of a lack of basic knowledge about on the part of potential allies. So these could be labor and human rights activists, legal and business professionals, to other stakeholders within the broader social justice movements here in the US and abroad. They're often not aware of these alternative models, how they work, their benefits, or their limitations. Secondly, fragmentation of the knowledge base. So we didn't find an accessible one-stop resource for visualizing and comparing a range of these alternative business models in a way that would be palatable or easy to understand for newcomers to the field. And then thirdly, we saw some gaps in knowledge about impact and effectiveness. So not enough is known about whether or which of these alternative corporate models have the potential to shift corporate behavior towards more sustainable rights-respecting behaviors. Okay, so what exactly is our project? So we're going to be assessing a range of alternative corporate structures, policies, or mechanisms. Collectively, we just use the term model just for simplicity, here in the US, or that have been proposed for the US, that purport to shift power or democratize to workers and communities in some ways. So here's a list of the models that we're going to be analyzing. Hopefully everyone can see that, some of which would be very familiar with a broad audience and others on this call, and others of these might be new to some. And some of these models have, like worker cooperatives or benefit corporations, have already been mentioned in the discussion so far. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a full description of each. And for that, you'll actually have to stay in touch and access our final product when it's ready. But there's some forms, just to point out here, that we're focusing that represent the greatest deviation from the prevailing corporate form. Those are what we're doing, what we're calling full assessments. We're going to be doing a full assessments on these because we see them as I say, deviating the most from the traditional models. And then there's others that have a more limited assessments, which are listed below. So the goal is to create a kind of simple schematic or interactive tool for new audiences to quickly learn about these models, and based on our summation and analysis, see which ones might be most appropriate for uptake to particular contexts, and otherwise do community building work around these concepts. What exactly will we be assessing? So the frame we'll be taking will roughly center on 3 categories of analysis, and hopefully this nifty graphic can illustrate while I talk it through. So whether and how each of the assessed models represents an actual shift in decision-making power towards workers or affected communities. Similarly, whether there's a shift in profit or benefit sharing to those individuals and groups, and whether and how they advance socially impactful or beneficial practices. So for each category, we're going to have a range of questions aiming to illuminate through desk research, through the literature, through case studies, through discussions with relevant stakeholders. We'll hope to illuminate the fodder that will populate our eventual tool. Going to wrap up now. So I'd love to stay in touch with folks. We have our contact information here. My email is there. We have a newsletter that folks can sign up to. And if you want to learn more about the project, our website, the Shifting Power website, is all here. I'm happy to also drop these in the chat. But hopefully that is good for now.
Thank you very much, Milap. That was really, really great. Very, very interesting project, and I think lots of us are going to want to track it and see what kinds of results you come up with. It occurs to me that one theme that is coming through all of the presentations and that maybe binds this panel together, an emerging theme, is how we negotiate and navigate democracy and participation at the boundaries of the firm, and how the internal context of the firm and the external environment, both in terms of society and both in terms of the initiatives that you've talked about in supply chains and sectors and elsewhere, how we can think about democratic practices with the sorts of relational processes which Charlotte talked about, how we can bring those together so that we start to have a more of a holistic, integrated system of organizations and the wider economic and social context. I would like to open this up now, please, to anybody here who's participating. Please put your questions in the chat. We have got a comment already from Ben Crawford, who asks, how do the structures of corporate law undermine the possibility of a democratic firm and deliberative processes, whether those are compassionate relational processes or otherwise? So if anybody's got any comments on the legal framework, I think that would be really helpful. So please put your hands up and I'll call you. Charlotte, yes, please go.
Yes, well, I don't know where you are based, Ben, but here in the UK, our corporate structure is highly problematic. It's still very focused on shareholder primacy. But what's really interesting is that I am seeing a very definite shift, a shift in mindset. So in 2006, we introduced our new Companies Act. It doesn't feel quite so new now, but within that act, there was the introduction of a section called Section 172, which was seen at the time as the idea of enlightened shareholder value. And it basically requires the directors to take into account the needs and interests of various stakeholders when operating the company. So they are meant to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members, shareholders, but in so doing, take into account these other stakeholder interests. Well, the bottom line is that particular provision has proven not to be very helpful. Lots of business actors are not satisfied with it because it doesn't give them sufficient clarity. And certainly the various stakeholder advocates are not at all satisfied with it. And the overall interpretation of that provision is that it still favours shareholder primacy. So it's a messy, not very good compromise. And I think that we can see the direction of travel at European level, at least, is to go way beyond Section 172. And with the requirement that's going to be introduced fairly soon at European level, at least, for due diligence around various kind of sustainability related issues, I think that's going to put far more demands on our boardrooms to make sure that they are certainly not exploiting the stakeholders, but hopefully it might encourage them to look, to work with the stakeholders more productively and more constructively. And I think in the United States, there were, back in the 1990s, a number of what we called non-shareholder constituency statutes introduced in various states, and they again proved not to be all that helpful, because they didn't really enable people to know, well, who's where in the hierarchy or in the level of priorities. So I think some reshaping of that has to be done. But for sure, I see society more and more questioning the shareholder primacy approach. So I do see it changing, and with the very urgent need to go to zero carbon, etc. I think that will speed up that push away from shareholder primacy. But where it takes us is still open to question.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Andrea, I was wondering whether you might have any comments upon this tricky area.
Tricky indeed. In fact, I think collaboration between deliberative Democrats and legal scholars is much needed at this point. In fact, when working on these themes, I realized that legal scholars had done much that would be relevant for a deliberative democratic analysis of business firms, but I cannot see as many ties being forged at the moment. But I think it's a matter of time. For instance, when I look at deliberative democracy at large, I see that now there is more and more interaction between political theorists, political sociologists, and legal scholars, because if you want to bring about deliberative democracy, you need to do it in legal terms most of the times. There are also other ways of doing it. So the same might need to happen also in this respect. As a sociologist, I can see that society is heading in that direction. This is something that can be empirically observed. So that's where my job ends in a way. I can make arguments as a political theorist, but to try to give a good answer to such a question, there is utter need for collaborative work.
Thank you. Milap, I'm not aware that the initiatives that you've looked at, the multi-stakeholder initiatives, are ever subject to any kind of regulation, whether there is a regulatory framework for them or they're just kind of voluntary through and through. Have you got any comments on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head of one of the issues that was identified in that report, is that these were, by design, the MSIs were voluntaristic initiatives that were meant to sort of thread the needle between government regulation and just industries acting on their own. And so by bringing stakeholders around the table, the idea was that they could set standards and codes of conduct in a voluntaristic manner. But as I'd mentioned in the report, that we identified that sort of the lack of binding force sort of undermined some of the effects of those MSIs.
Yes, thank you very much. Wolfgang, it would be interesting to get your reflections on what seems to be coming through here, which is how we bring an internally organised democracy to bear upon external societal level democracy and other kinds of initiatives such as multi-stakeholder initiatives, and indeed whether there is a role of regulation in that.
Yeah.
Be interested to have your thoughts on that general topic.
Well, I try. First of all, I think the failure of historical examples of organizational democracy, as we had in Austria, shows that isolated examples, and even if they are big enterprises, they have very bad chances to survive in an environment which is embarrassing, which is hindering them. So I think the idea of major stakeholder democracy like Bristol has presented us. This is a very interesting example of creating also to some degree an alternative environment in which compassion, like you have developed the concept of collective compassion to us, in which compassion can develop more and more collectively. Yeah, but I think it wouldn't be enough if those firms, social enterprises, cooperatives, whatever, who want to support their employees in developing more compassion, more broad perspective, remote perspective, taking cosmopolitanism, and so it would have success if there are not forms developed following the idea of deliberation, like Andrea, you have presented to us, and that also means in big enterprises, in corporations like Unterrainer, yeah, there is a big demand, I think, for the management, for the employees, and of course the researchers to combine representative forms of stakeholder and inter-stakeholder democracy with new novel forms of deliberation. Yeah, may it be concepts like democratic dialogues, like future conferences, preferred futuring, and further forms of direct democracy. Yeah, but nevertheless, I think third component is always state. Yeah, the public institutions that have to support those forms of inter-stakeholder democracy also by funding. Yeah, otherwise it will be generated, I think.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I want to refer to an earlier point that was made by Noi Amante from the Philippines. And Noi asks, I think about the local context and local cultural context. And the point was made that relational networks equal compassionate workplaces, and it's in stressful jobs, most especially it's something that resonates in East Asia, where there are quite scarce and adverse resources and situations for people to be able to experience relational networks. So then just making that a more general question, what kinds of cultural settings, what kinds of local settings are more conducive to the kinds of democratic formations that we want to see, that are imbued with the kind of relational process that Charlotte describes, but also encompasses the type of structural democratic hardwired DNA in an organization, which Wolfgang has been looking at. So maybe I could just do a little round of you all again, if that's okay, maybe starting off with Andrea and just asking you how you might respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there has been a bit of small is beautiful kind of thinking in democratic theory when it comes to workplace democracy. In fact, a lot of empirical studies have shown the limits of local organization experimenting with democratic practice. And say that the face-to-face and group dimension that a lot of local enterprises have can be a factor that pushes in a deliberative participatory direction, might be an enabling factor. within this family of organizations, we think those that by their nature have a sensibility, an ethical attitude would be, of course, more promising grounds for democratic efforts. So I'm thinking of like some local sustainable firms, but it would need to be studied, and there are studies going on to try sort out which local reality might be more conducive to democratic engagement. But if something is not conducive to democratic engagement, I think we need to take it into account, but not necessarily stop at it. I mean, we can play with the factors that can ease democratic engagement also in local organizations and local firms.
Milap, it will be good to hear what kinds of comments you would have, particularly looking at this voluntaristic set of initiatives that are so very widespread in so many supply chains and sectors now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understood the correction, the question, I would sort of rephrase it away from like which cultural settings are more conducive to these sorts of things, than to which sort of socio-economic and political systems have evolved to be more sort of conducive towards the things we're talking about here, deliberative participatory democracy. And I think what the trend is definitely the sort of Anglo-American brand of capitalism, of corporate structure, is particularly rigid and hierarchical and doesn't allow for this sort of sharing of power that we've seen. I think Charlotte has pointed out that that is coming under a bit of attack now and within this context and perhaps in the UK as well. But I think what we've seen from our research as well is that like there are other, you know, certainly looking at the European context, there's a more of a history of involvement of works councils, of workers on boards, of organizations, which perhaps nods to a certain you know, context in which it's arisen, that, you know, labor plays a much larger role in the economy and in workplace decisions than it does here in the US. So I think that's hopefully addressing, I think, the original question slightly reframed.
I would actually like to ask you another question, all of you actually, and I'm going to start then with Charlotte and Wolfgang, which is we're collecting here, to my mind, an incredibly rich set of ideas, concepts, themes, models, projects, and all the rest of it. How does a collection of ideas and initiatives along the lines that we've suggested, how can we bring those together to help effect change in organizations that are trying to navigate complex futures? So I'm thinking here of not regulation. Regulation plays its part, but how can we reach out to organizations that are really trying to genuinely struggle and wrestle with these issues in order to create change for themselves and their communities? Charlotte. Charlotte,
I beg your pardon. Yes, right. Yes, got you back. Yes, I think it's a really a very nice question. Well, I suppose what we're doing today is our starting point, isn't it? I mean, I have found this discussion so interesting, and I realise, you know, we're all working in different areas, and yet clearly we have connections with our work. There's no doubt about that. I can see really interesting links for all of us. So I guess things like events like this are an excellent starting point. And I do feel that in the UK, there is a movement in the business sector that does want to do the right things. I genuinely think that. I've seen lots and lots of work being done by, business actors and events being put on where they want to talk about these issues. So I think there's an appetite for it, not just from the stakeholders' perspective, but also from the business actors' perspective. I do feel that. I also see that in the shareholder and investor movement. Now, some of that may well be greenwash or whitewash, but I don't think it is. I think there's a genuine appetite to do the right thing. And I notice in the chat that Shan Turnbull mentions a company, the John Lewis Partnership. And that's a really interesting example where the employees are seen as partners of the business. If I'm correct, and until relatively recently, employees did actually share in the bonuses, in the profits. So I think that they've been cut to a degree, but nevertheless, I think by putting out there the good examples, and there are lots of good examples, there are lots of really marvelous businesses that are democratic, that do work in cooperation with the whole workforce and with their stakeholders. I think we need to educate the rest of the business community as widely as we can of those good examples. And that for us as writers and as researchers, we also need to bring that out as much as possible in our writing and work with those good examples, find out what it is that they are doing, why they're doing it right, and how can that be spread further afield. But I also do feel that the legal frameworks that we set ourselves do shape some of those cultures. And so corporate law mechanisms such as limited liability, separate legal personality, can unfortunately encourage the bad practices as well. And so we see some egregious examples that happen in group structures or subsidiary supply chain structures where we see exploitative practices that are enabled by the legal framework around them. So I think that it's a real mix of different things there, but education and changing the regulatory frameworks would, to me, be major starting points.
Thank you very much. As we were talking about this, Alexander puts up a comment asking, well, who should be included in workplace deliberations if the boundaries of the firm are becoming blurrier? Who are the people who are included in the circle of those who have charge of shared decision making within the firm and then connecting to those outside of the firm? And Shan mentions institutional investors, and are they included in this circle of all those who are affected? I don't know. Wolfgang, would you like to say something about this circle of those who have an entitlement to be involved in the deliberations of the organization, and whether that boundary extends beyond the firm to the external stakeholders, not just the workers?
For me,
Wolfgang, I'm terribly sorry. We can't hear you. It's very broken up and blurry. I don't know whether you would like to write just one or two short sentences to go into the chat, and then we could capture that as a record. Can I go back to you, Milap, and ask you, because you've had a sight of those people who are outside the boundaries of the organization in multi-stakeholder initiatives. How would you answer this question of who are those who ought to be involved in the circle of decision makers? Who are the all affected?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily give a prescription here. I think to just point to, and I can see in the chat, there's some really interesting examples and ideas already being presented. But point to, there are existing sort of models that are out there that we will be including in our research, which share workplace deliberations and include a greater set of stakeholders in workplace deliberations. So multi-stakeholder cooperatives are an example where not just workers have decision-making power, but also consumers or others along the supply chain. And there's examples here in the US, and I think otherwise in other parts of the world. There's also, I think, that the trust model is a really interesting one, because you can set up a trust that holds a controlling share of a business entity to benefit any purpose, right? It could be to benefit the broader environment, and that purpose cannot be changed but through all of the shareholders or stakeholders coming into it. So I think it really depends on the obviously the context, but there are models out there that point us towards ways that you can involve a broader set of stakeholders. And it's just about, I think to the points that were raised, it's about education about these models. It's about really activism around these models to say, like, there isn't just this one way of structuring a corporation, and that there's a variety of different methods out there that could potentially illuminate the way.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to the end of our session, but I would just like to ask each of you to make one final short comment, either on something that you've will take away as particularly interesting, or something else entirely. Wolfgang, if you could write yours in the chat, that would be really great. So Andrea, can I start off with you? Just one final short comment.
And see that there's can be original for so many times and making bridges. As a student of social I think that what we're doing is very important. What we're seeing happening is very important. This democratizing workplace is something that needs to happen, but it will not happen only as a decision from the top down. Likely today we might gain momentum towards also a popular interest in this topic, and this is something that more and more the more so this is a bit of a note of optimism that I take me from the event and from the movement.
Thank you. Charlotte, one comment from you.
Yes, I think that for me, the outcome of this discussion tells me that structures matter. And I think that there is a shift happening as we speak. I think that we are moving. How quickly we reach the place we want to be is another question. But I think in terms of broader social sustainability, we should be shifting more quickly than we are.
Thank you. And Milap.
Sure. I mean, firstly, just really appreciative of these discussions and the other panelists and your moderation, Ruth. But I think for me, I actually would maybe say not the opposite of Charlotte, but another side of it, which is structures certainly matter, and that's actually what our work is. But actually, I've learned a great deal from both you and Andrea and Wolfgang and his team about the sort of softer forms of deliberation and compassion, and those are actually things that companies can do now, right? Like, it doesn't need structural change, and I think we want to have both the threat of structural change, government regulation, as well as these ideas that it's not hard to be a compassionate and democratic workplace. It is actually a mindset thing as well. And there's perhaps other forms of pressure and activism and regulation that can affect the same changes. So thank you again to everyone.
Thank you all very much indeed. I'm most grateful to you for your fantastic presentations. It's been such a wonderful discussion. I've enjoyed it so much. I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you all again in real life. You never know, we might all be able to get together face to face. That would be brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable.